Good afternoon and welcome to this, the first of two sessions to look into recent developments in defence industry, particularly the question of the procurement of the fleet solid support ships and also General Electric's proposal to move certain sensitive work from Rugby to a site in France. We have three leading figures from the relevant trade unions with us today in the first of these two sessions, and I'd invite each of them just to say a brief word to introduce themselves, starting with Steve.
So I'm Steve Kerr. I've worked for General Electric now in its various names for the last 25 years, and I'm a member of the European Works Council and a union convener for the last 20 years.
Steve Turner, I'm Assistant General Secretary at Unite with responsibility for our manufacturing sectors.
Ross Murdoch, I'm a National Officer for the GMB and I also chair the Confederation of Shipbuilding Engineering Unions Maritime Forum.
Thank you. And can I just put on the record the gratitude of the committee to the relevant unions for bringing aspects of these matters to our attention in the first place, which we certainly thought has been well worthwhile investigating. Starting off now with John Speller.
Yes, I mean, how important would you say to the UK shipbuilding industry is the contract for the fleet solid support ships?
The easy answer to that is that it's absolutely vital. In order to sort of qualify that, I think if we go back to when Sir John Parker carried out his research and investigation before he informed the National Shipbuilding Strategy, he carried out extensive research and there was real meaningful engagement with all stakeholders, but he certainly engaged with all of the CSE unions, which is predominantly GMB, Unite and Prospect. And there was, at the end of that, the report was published in 2016, and I think it would be fair to say that across all those union members, there was a real sense of hope that the future was looking bright. Because Sir John, he lauded the success of the carrier programme, and in particular, he put it up as a real model of success and a model that could be replicated in the future. And some of the things he highlighted in that is about the shipbuilding employers themselves, how well the collaboration between different shipbuilding employers went. And again, the block modular building. There's a lot of the stuff when he talked about a real renaissance in shipbuilding, and a lot of the things that he characterised that renaissance in shipbuilding was an entrepreneurial attitude. He talked about an enthusiasm to embrace change, and he also talked about the highly skilled workforce in terms of how flexible they were and prepared to change. So as far as the CSE unions were concerned, all the key ingredients were there for that renaissance to continue. But of course, the other point that Sir John raised, that it was conditional on there being a steady drumbeat of orders for that to happen. And that's for a number of reasons, because clearly from an employer's point of view, if there's a steady drumbeat of orders, then it gives them the confidence to invest, whether that's in technology, research and development, and future apprentices. So there was a real encouragement of the industry, the trade unions and the government to work together to drive that renaissance forward. And to be honest, the unions, GMB, Unite and Prospect, CSE unions were all up for that challenge, absolutely. But that hope, I would say, started to turn to a little bit of despair, because although we had the Type 26 contract, which pretty much keeps work on the Upper Clyde yards for a significant amount of time, there has been no steady drumbeat outside of that. The steady drumbeat of orders that Sir John talked about has not materialised. And then, of course, with the government's reluctance to restrict the FSS tender, the trade unions were arguing that it was important for our sovereign defence capability, it was also important for prosperity. And even further than that, the National Shipbuilding Strategy moved the offshore patrol vessels also out of the category of Warship. So not only were they not categorising FSS, OPVs were also taken out. And to be honest, that despair was really realised in March 2019 this year when Appledore Shipyard closed. That was real blow to the shipbuilding family, if you like, particularly to the North Devon community, because we weren't talking about a recent start-up. We're talking about a company with 165 years of defence shipbuilding. I think it was near on 200 ships they'd built. And if you look at situations in other yards, I mean, we've had redundancies at Camel Laird. Harland and Wolff is up for sale, so the future's unknown at the moment. And probably one that's been missed a lot with all the headline stuff about Appledore is the rundown of the carrier programme has really, hit hard at Rosyth Dockyard. There's been 3 phases of redundancies, and the total number so far is 550. But because they've come in 3 phases, 250, 150, 150, it's kind of not gone unnoticed, but it's kind of slipped a little bit. And to be honest with you, if FSS is not going to be done in UK yards, those figures are likely to rise at Rosyth. And of course there'll be some dependency on wherever the Type 31E contract is placed. But, if, for example, if Rosyth wasn't to win Type 31 and FSS wasn't in there, and I don't think it's been sensationalist, the workforce up there is saying that from a workforce total of 2,000 in October 2017, if they don't win any of those 2 contracts, they could actually see that that could go down to at best 1,200, with that work. So that's a bit of a long way of saying how important is FSS to UK shipbuilding. It's absolutely vital.
So just assuming that the Rosyth point, if Rosyth don't have that order and don't have Type 31, what will be the impact on the capability of Rosyth to then be fit for purpose for the carrier refit programme when they come in for a major refit?
I think it starts to get very difficult, because when you start to let staff go, I mean, history has shown that there's never a guarantee that you'll get them back. Because even if some came back for one of those contracts, if it was again only going to be a small contract, it might only last a few years, people might make the decision not to bother if they thought they were going to go through the same process again. But I mean, if there was certainty there on 31 and FSS, then you stand a much better chance of retaining a highly skilled workforce for the future, for future refit work and for shipbuilding work.
Sir John Parker's report, and ministers seem to hang on to that report for grim life. Keep quoting it with regard to this artificial separation between military and non-military vessels. Have you had any engagement with Sir John Parker as to whether that is actually creating the difficulties, as you rightly said, for the drumbeat of the industry?
Not since he'd carried out his research and published his report. We've contributed to the all-party parliamentary group investigation. We've also contributed to Sir Philip Dunn's review on prosperity. So we have raised this time and time again through whatever medium we
especially because he's due to do an update of his report later this year, and I think we need to have a look at that. So, quite apart from the internal side of it all, when we're talking about the bidding process, to what extent would you say that UK shipbuilders are at a disadvantage compared to overseas competitors who are allowed into the programme?
I think UK is at a major disadvantage. I think if we look at the shortlist competitors for the FSS programme, and I think it's Daewoo in South Korea, Japan Marine United Corporation, Navantia in Spain, and Fincantieri in Italy. And I mean, there's some of the stuff that we've done previously, I can always send copies of these, CSEU, GMB, and Unite's done research as well. I mean, we've highlighted that these competitors are either, if they're not state-owned, then they're state-subsidised, either directly or indirectly. So that places UK, Team UK, as I always like to call them, a disadvantage in terms of competing against them. South Korea and Japan have had high levels of indirect subsidies through government programmes. Spain's Navantia, there was reports that they had received illegal subsidies around about 2010. And basically, generally, the Italian shipbuilding tends to benefit from government policies that reserve the work for their domestic yards. And although they're not one of the bidders, I think it was quite interesting recently when you seen the French Defence Procurement Agency making the announcement in terms of their own 4 support ships that they have procured those and they will be built in France. So although they're not one of the competitors, again, it's another example of where other competitor countries very easily make the decision to ensure one way or another that the work is done in their yards rather than go out to, in FSS's case, international tender. And I mean, even some of the more subjective stuff that some of the members we represent have been saying recently, if you couple the French contract for the 4 ships with recent examples of Spanish incursions, shall we say, into Gibraltar waters, because at the moment the media seems to be reporting that Navantia and Spain are favourites to win FSS. And our members are saying to us, we've had all this going on in Gibraltar and we're seriously going to award contracts to... We have said it's media reporting at the moment, but you can see the point. So our members have long argued that why don't we adopt the same examples as some of the other countries.
France is reinforced by the fact that over the holiday period, the French Defence Minister has announced that they're keeping all of their yards open and indeed are allocating orders in order to sustain that. Final question from myself is on the question of the Mars tanker contracts with the Koreans, which was underpriced anyway by all accounts and ended up making sizable losses, which seem to have been covered, but to the detriment of British yards.
Yes, that was well reported. I mean, the reasons at the time it was awarded was, there was a capability issue, but also it was supposedly going to be cheaper, and I think it was reasons for exchange rates was one of the reasons given. But as we were later to find out that wasn't necessarily the case, it was late being completed and over cost as well. But I think your question there about what can we do, I think really adopt the same, reclassify, and I don't think certainly the shipbuilding unions have never said at any time these should be awarded to us at any cost. We understand the need for financial prudence, etc. We understand that, but yeah.
Steve, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly, because Ross is speaking on behalf of the joint unions through the CSEU on this particular panel. I just wanted to raise the point about some of the difficulty that we have with Treasury and cross-departmental work, because there is a fundamental failure to recognise a multiplier effect when it comes to procured costs. So we did a lot of work and a lot of independent research work on the 36 pence in the pound that comes back for every pound invested here in the UK, which is not recognised in any bidding process, but of course is recognised the social and economic impact of spending a pound, and indeed not spending a pound here in the UK, is recognised by other nation states elsewhere, and therefore they do invest in home nations to defend jobs and skills. And more than just the skills, the knowledge as well. You can often replace a skill with a 4-year, 5-year apprenticeship and 5 years of additional work. 40 years of knowledge and experience is irreplaceable. And when those workers from Rosyth that were being spoken about, and ultimately that will be around 900 jobs that will leave Rosyth, when that knowledge, that collective knowledge goes, that makes it impossible for that work to be picked up again in 5 years' time. It's going to be incredibly difficult for any of those shipyards, block building on the FSS contract, or indeed a successful bid on the 31E, if we don't see a central pipeline of work and a recognition of the benefit of spending a pound here. And just finally on the cross-departmental work, because we've got Type 26 being built on the Clyde, and all of that steel to produce Type 26 frigates is coming in from Sweden, while we're desperate for work in our UK steel yards. There's 120,000 tonnes of steel, 80,000 tonnes on 2 ship build with a third option, another 40,000 tonnes of steel. And there's no recognition across departments in government that that work should be integrated, that steel should be produced in UK steel plants, and the 250,000 kilometres of cabling that went into every one of those two carriers, each of the two carriers, equally with all of our frigate work, all of our defence work that's going on at the moment, and indeed the FSS. Some integrated, joined-up, synchronised thinking between departments would actually give us an industrial and a defence strategy that worked for UK PLC. And the failure to do that, quite frankly, is a betrayal. It's a betrayal of skilled jobs. It's a betrayal of those communities that have supported UK shipbuilding and our defence industries for hundreds of years.
Steve, as you brought this up now, it was going to be our next but one topic, but as we're into the prosperity agenda, we'll go to Ruth next and then come back to Gavin.
Before I move on to the question, just 'cause it ties into both what Steve and Ross were saying, we've been here before with Barrow, and it's like we've learnt nothing at all from the loss of skills that we had in Barrow, and then how much it's cost us as a country because we didn't have a steady drumbeat of orders, and it's that message I think that we all need to push.
Programme at Barrow as a result of that.
Probably should declare my register of interests at this point, GMB and Unite, but right, so does the government understand the potential contribution to national prosperity of awarding these contracts to British firms? Do you think they get it at all?
Say no. I would say no. I mean, we have heard whenever a contract is awarded, we do hear some fine words from government that indicates that they do, but they certainly don't back it up. There's no serious policy behind it to back it up. And I think, I think any government, and the trade union view, any government that was going to put the FSS order out to international competition just doesn't get it at all, because, the point that Steve just made about the return to the Treasury, again, it's such a simple thing for our members to grasp. They cannot see why politicians don't, and I don't know whether it's Treasury or the Defence, MOD itself, but it's sorry, you want to...
Can I just interject to that point? On the basis of past experience, is there a massive disparity between the sort of bids that come in when you do put something out to international tender compared with when you decide to keep it in-house to the UK? Would you say that the government's response to the argument that you're making would be, well, with a limited defence budget, we simply cannot afford not to put this out to tender because it would cost a huge amount more if we reserved this to the UK only? Or would you say that the difference in price is not nearly enough, the savings that might be made, to compensate for the loss in terms of skills and in terms of money spent and fed back into the UK economy? Any past experience to give us a guide to this?
Well, there wasn't a bid, of course, for the Mars tankers, and I think because of there was a couple of reasons for that, but we regularly talk to the shipbuilding employers about Type 31, about FSS, and the indications we're getting is that they believe that they will be able to get close with a bid. So if you factor in the weighting or criteria that weights things, that Steve's just gone through about return to the Treasury, tax, national insurance. Plus, the other thing that is often forgotten about is potentially there's a flip side to if the jobs do go in terms of increased welfare benefits, because if people don't find alternative work because of what's gone outside. So that return would, even if the bids were close, the fact that you can have something around the 30% return, is a significant weighting.
But if the bids were close, but we had an international competition, but the UK came in second, as it were, and not with the lowest bid, would the UK still have the discretion to be able, nevertheless, to award it to the UK bid?
Well, I believe they have, because there's been some recent examples, where certainly in terms of the competition side of it. There was the Transport Secretary recently awarded a contract without competition for the Brexit ferries, but probably the least said about that, the better. But there's been I think that when Philip Hammond was Defence Secretary, he awarded contracts without competition.
No, that wasn't quite my question. My question was, if we go to a competition and the British consortium that's bidding in the competition puts in quite a competitive proposal, but it's not the cheapest, am I right in understanding that the government could still go with the British proposal, and if that's the case, might they not be going down this route in order to try and get the best and most realistic bid from the British that they can?
That's an interesting question. But yeah, no, the answer to they could still award it, and they could use the argument. There's a couple of arguments, you know, the prosperity argument, sovereign defence capability, future industrial capability as well, retaining the skills. There's a number of key areas where you could easily
lost if it does go to competition. There's still a good chance the British consortium could win, even if it doesn't come in with the lowest bid.
But only if they then take into account, which they're able to, even under EU regulations, of local value. Mm-hmm. The question is, they seem to put a very low value price on local value in those in that evaluation.
Just to add to that, I mean, our experience in discussions with the MOD about all of these issues has been that the advancement of competition is more ideological than it is about even the economics of it. It may very well be that there are differences in tendered price, but there's a lot of retrofit that's being done on the Miles tankers, for instance, down at AMP in Falmouth. There's an awful lot of retrofit work that needs to be done because they were built under quality. That's the reality of it. And I will do. Yeah, absolutely will do. We've got our people working on them, and they've been working on them for a long time. Not just fitting out for military purposes, but retrofitting some of the work quality that was done in Korea on the Miles tankers. So we're quite happy to do that, but this failure to recognise, this refusal really, to recognise the multiplier effect or indeed local value or the impact of not spending £1 in the UK and the knock-on impact of that on skills and jobs and communities, and all of those outside of the direct employment as well. I mean, the 900 jobs that will leave Rosyth as a consequence of the FSS not going to Rosyth, for instance, or the Type 31 not being deployed for build into Rosyth and elsewhere. Well, the knock-on impact in the community on all of those jobs in the supply chain and the logistics distribution side of things, and the other suppliers that supply components and others into that site, the local pub, the cafe, the newsagent, the hairdresser, the supermarket, whatever it might be, none of that is taken into account. And every time we've had discussions with the MOD about that, it's been an ideological obsession with free market competition. It's not been about the economics of it, although they hide behind the economics, failing to recognise the social and economic impact of not spending £1 here.
Yeah, I was just going to add on one of the points that Steve raised earlier about steel, because we've been having ourselves in United Community, we've been having regular meetings, with BIS, and we've raised FSS, and sometimes the argument that comes back is there's no longer the capability, for plate. But we've always argued that if you put capacity there, then the industry will invest, and so there's a knock-on effect, not just to shipbuilding communities and shipbuilding yards. The same applies to steel as well.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah, just one final question on this. What policy prescription would you like to see? Would you like a formal formula that the Treasury and the MOD had to consider that included social value? Would you like? What would you actually like to see in terms of a policy prescription?
We contributed to Sir Philip Dunn's review, and I know that was one of the potential recommendations that he put that the government should consider, a criteria and a weighting that factored in things like return to the Treasury, prosperity for UK.
Just to add again, we're alone on this, to be honest. I travel into Europe a lot and I talk to counterparts in Europe, and we really are the laughingstock of Europe, let alone anywhere else. When it comes to
who don't do it, is that
we don't do it. The French have just issued their instructions on their own FSS vessels. They're going to build them in France, and I don't see the UK government complaining to the European Union about unfair competition on that one, for instance. Let alone the French worrying about it, even if they were to put in a formal complaint to the European Commission. They will not build outside of France, just like the US won't build outside the US. We seem to be the only nation that takes literally some requirement to procure on an open competition basis within the EU procurement regulations. And it's false. It's false. So the capacity is already there for the UK government to make these decisions. The capacity to take into account the local impact and the social and economic impact is already there. It's a political choice as to whether or not government chooses to exercise its discretion in those areas. And our experience would show us that they do not choose to do that. And that's a choice.
I think your earlier question, you know, if it is some sort of cunning plan to drive price down in terms of competition, I don't think so. But if at the end of it, they then took in that social policy and looked at the criteria and the weighting and actually made a judgment based on all of those factors rather than just the one that's a quid cheaper, then, you know, you could understand it. But when there's no consideration to that return, you know, and it's not just the return on taxation, national insurance, that multiplier effect that was referred to earlier. If people are working and spend in their own local communities, that generates their own economy. You know, so it's.
I guess just to complete that point, Ross or Steve, I mean, what the chairman outlined would be rather suboptimal if at the end of a process you were saying, well, UK company came second, international company came first, but we'll recognise those points. It should be there front and centre at the very start of the process. It should be ingrained in the scoring matrix for any application in its separate elements: national capacity, skills base, social return, etc., etc. All of those should carry with them elements of points or scoring for the application's scrutiny. That's the way you would rather see it. That's the way it should be. Chair, I should just declare that I've signed the Confederation's charter, their pledge on shipbuilding. I did that in October, just so it's open. Ross, can I ask you, because you have talked about numbers and jobs, if the contract were awarded to a UK consortium, would that sustain jobs that are already there, or would it allow for the production or the creation of new jobs within the United Kingdom?
I think absolutely it would create new jobs and new apprenticeships.
Do you have any figures to have?
Well, I mean, and again, we've both done research, GMB and CSEU and Unite. But I know certainly looking at the GMB research in terms of FSS, our research suggests that it would create approximately 1,800 shipyard jobs if they were UK built. Those figures include steel and it includes wider manufacturing supply chain jobs as well, but significant numbers.
1,800 new jobs. Yeah. And if the contract is lost to a firm outside the United Kingdom, you've talked 800, 900 jobs in Rosyth, but have you modelled any further impact beyond that 1 yard?
I mean, it's difficult to quantify completely how many jobs would be lost. We've actually submitted the GMB submitted a Freedom of Information, and we're waiting the MOD. They're considering it at the moment. But again, it would, I guess, if one of the consortiums that's in the bidding for Type 31 wins it, then that would mitigate some loss. You know, so it's difficult to quantify it exactly at the moment because we touched on Rosyth, where I said about 2,000 in 2017, but if they were unsuccessful, it could be down as low as 1,100 if they're not successful with either of those two contracts. And we've already lost, well, there was 200 jobs at Appledore, 100 of them have gone redundancy. The other 100 at the moment are taking the opportunity to, on a trial basis, redeploy to Devonport Dockyard. Whether they all stay, I don't think they will because it's a 4-hour round trip. So it's either relocate, which for some people, you know, they've lived in the North Devon area all their life, so I think that's unlikely. We've already seen, I mean, Camel Laird announced 291 job losses, which ironically was, that announcement came 3 days after the government announced the contract for the RFA ships. You know, and Camel Laird won 2 of those contracts. And yet, 3 days later, Camel Laird were announcing 291 redundancies. But I think Harland and Wolff have got a core workforce of about 114, and it's topped up by probably 100 agency. But the latest reports we've had from Harland and Wolff is they've got no work beyond the third quarter of this year. You know, so that's another one. And they've got no apprentices, and at the moment they don't have any plans for apprentices. Ferguson Marine on the Lower Clyde has work at the moment, but not long term. You know, so it's difficult to quantify. I think the thought is that if the BAE consortium wins Type 31, it may well be that Camel Laird will build Type 31. That's not a given. That's what's been reported. However, if the Babcock consortium wins it, well, the view was it would have been built in Appledore, but that's gone. Possibly the Scythe. You know, so if the FSS contract doesn't come, the yards that are not successful with Type 31 are going to be vulnerable for either further job losses. We would hope no more closures, but I don't think we could say hand on heart we could guarantee there wouldn't be any further closures.
No, just some credit where credit is due, and I just want to put on record that whilst Camel Laird did announce 291 job losses in a redundancy notice at risk, not a single job has been lost at Camel Laird's. And we did work very hard, and it's still not over at Camel Laird's, but we are now down to 79 jobs at risk, and we're working very, very hard to mitigate those 79 as well. But we've saved 220 plus jobs at Camel Laird already, and working very well with the Ministry of Defence on bringing forward contracts. The RFA work, for instance, we brought that forward, and we're working with other contractors as well, including placing out in the wider contractor area jobs. So we put 40 workers on secondment into BAE at Samlesbury from Camel Laird, and they'll go back into Camel Laird, and that's a really pioneering agreement. It's skills retention work, and it's something that isn't really recognised here in the UK. But if you go into Germany, for instance, or other European countries in particular, that's quite commonplace, and there are agreements and even insurance-backed schemes to go short-time working during the bathtub, and that's the problem that we find in much of the shipbuilding industry. And there are insurance-backed schemes underwritten by the state, and we're talking to government about that, and about a similar insurance-backed scheme that companies pay into during the good times, of course, so that when there is a difficulty in a downturn in work, we don't lose all of those skills. We share work, we go on to downtime working, and as the industry picks up, we've got a ready built workforce already, and upskilled during that period as well. And it's really, really important that we recognise that.
Chair, I was going to ask Ross about the fear around some of the yards. I think you've fairly addressed that question in advance of me asking it, albeit you know my particular interest with Harland Wolff in my constituency. Just when we're talking about figures and the numbers of jobs potentially at risk, and FSS, which is predicated on 2 with an option for a third, and Steve, you've talked about the steel associated if there's a third. Are your figures, Ross, based on there being 3 ships built or on 2?
They were based.
If it is only 2, if there are only 2 to be built, then what impact is that going to have?
Well, I think if we, first of all, I wouldn't get the rationale behind the 2. I think there was some talk about 2 plus the option of 1. I mean, ideally we would want 3. If you're only going to build 2 for a start, then you have got 2 aircraft carriers and just 2 supply ships. You know, and there's always, if one gets taken out for refit, maintenance work, then you're leaving the carriers light. You know, so whilst we would absolutely want the 3, but would we refuse the 2? No, we wouldn't. But you know, there are reasons why the 2 would not be attractive. I would suggest for government. And I'm not quite sure what measure or what detail the government would be using in terms of the 2, as I said, because of the...
2 rather than 3, then is there a material reduction in the jobs figures that you gave us earlier? Are they cut by a third, do you know? Are they...
Well, I think there's an economies of scales argument to that, because usually with any shipbuilding contract, by the time you get towards the end, you've learnt from the early on. You know, so you lose some of those arguments about economies of scale if you're only building 2, whereas if it's 3, it's not a straightforward arithmetic, shall we say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Phil?
Declare an interest as well as member of Unite and GMB. Do you agree with the government's refusal to classify the FS ships as warships? Guido Bebb has actually said that there's no national security interest that requires that they should be classified as warships. And if you believe that it was a wrong move, do you think it's too late to change the classification?
The second part of your question, if it's too late, we don't think it's too late, and the early reports from the previous Defence Procurement Minister suggested that when it was opened up, there was no risk of compensation, etc. So unless something's changed, we don't believe it's too late, and therefore we would strongly argue again that the government rethinks this and reclassifies. And I think we've already talked about some of the previous competitor countries that have already made decisions to build them in their own. So I think the evidence is there from Europe, certainly, that they can be reclassified and, single source procurement restricted. And I think even, I think there was, the Minister, I think in his reply to the chair of the Defence Select Committee, I took it that he as good as admitted that he said that it could be done. Because and also in the Defence Department's own contract, they've actually described the role of an FSS ship, and its primary role is to support warfighting operations. It has to operate and survive against a capable and hostile enemy threat. Sounds warlike warship to me. And I think even if you look at a support ship contract, we don't have to go back too far in history to the Falklands conflict, where the Sir Galahad was bombed. It was an RFA ship. So there's evidence there. And I think I haven't seen any legislation that's changed what happened if you go back even further. Because in the 80s they were classed as warships. I haven't seen anything that's changed that.
And exclusively rules imposed by the EU that are responsible for this dilemma?
I think it's ministerial decisions in the UK.
Yeah, but there are no other rules. That's what I'm trying to get at. The only rules that we're concerned about are EU rules. So it's either ministers doing what they want to do and sheltering behind EU rules, or it's EU rules, but there's no other third possibility.
I wrote to the Minister myself, and the response I got was quite interesting, and I won't read the whole letter, but the bit where he said, it is conceivable that other nations have applied exemptions where the UK has chosen not to, but which are still reasonable in their own national security context and wholly compliant with EU law. So again, that suggests it's ministerial decision rather than or interpretation of law. Other countries are interpreting it to suit domestic, whereas we're not.
We'll be having a minister in the next session, so we'll be able to explore that.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Do you think as well that it's a requirement that the are reclassified in the national security interest as well?
I concur completely with what Ross has just said. I find it perverse that we even go down this route for all the reasons that we've been through already, to be fair. These are warships. These will operate in war zones. They carry munitions to supply a carrier fleet. They travel alongside destroyers and others. They're incredibly vulnerable. Even in their build, they're incredibly vulnerable, but they are protected by a core group of Royal Marines on each. They've got helicopter landing pads on them, and the Army use those, the Navy use those, of course, to deploy troops. These are warships. In any other name of, or game we were playing around the naming of a vessel, these would be warships. But of course they're not. They're not classified as warships, and I think that suits a political aim, a political objective, as opposed to a definitive EU piece of regulation.
Mark.
Thank you. I don't have a trade union affiliation to declare, gentlemen, but everybody seems to have to declare something. So I declare my father. I declare my father was a naval veteran. Hopefully that can. Just to press you a bit, Mr. Turner, on this point about whether they're warships or not. So they are clearly designed to go in harm's way because they're designed to accompany the carrier. And brutally, the fleet commander, if necessary, would use that as a decoy for the carrier. So are they designed to carry any kind of defensive armament, flares or, that they're going to have a defensive?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do they have any armament Do they have any anti-aircraft machine guns or anything like that? They do. What, they're going to have 30mm cannon or something?
I don't know the technical specifications of their armaments, but they are definitely armed ships.
Yeah,
they're light arms for defence.
Okay,
yes.
All right. So do they have a command centre?
I would take it they come under the carrier.
A command centre, in the bowels of the ship. They're not fought from the bridge. They're fought from the command centre. Do they have a command centre?
I would be purely speculating to say that they do, other than to think that it would be, again, a ridiculous position if they weren't controlled by the central carrier command fleet.
Yeah. They'll be under the command of the carrier,
yes.
But a modern warship has a command centre in its guts, basically, and if they've got one of those, that only amplifies the case. So maybe you could look at that and drop us a note about what you consider to be their warlike characteristics, if you follow my line of questioning. Yep. Okay? Thank you. Right, so to move on. Is there one UK consortium in the competition now, or two? You've mentioned BAE Systems and you mentioned Babcock, so...
That's for Type 31.
Right,
I'm talking about Type 31E contract. There's a BAE-led consortium, a Babcock-led consortium, and a third consortium as well. They're working together on FSS. It's one team UK working together.
And what, in your assessment, is the likelihood of them winning the competition? If you wanted to give us a kind of, I don't know, a percentage likelihood, where would you put it?
Well, I think again we've touched on where there's a disadvantage because of I think I don't understand the intricacies and the complexities of competition with commercial contracts. But my understanding from previous ones is there are different timescales in each contract, some of which requires money to be put up front to get to the next stage. Now, if the other competitors are all either state-owned or state-subsidised directly or indirectly, then that's much easier and much more advantageous than UK. Because if the UK has no state subsidies, then it would be down to the employers themselves to put money up. And I would suggest that they would probably need to have some very understanding shareholders who would give them the green light to put money up with no guarantee of any return. So I think it places us, from what we can gather, the Team UK believe they can get a bit close. But if there are timelines built within that contract that means additional monies have to be put up, we can already see a situation where the UK could be at a disadvantage. And we would hope that they would stay in the bid. But depending on what that sort of level of outlay is, then there's always a danger that the UK companies might think,
push you on this because this is really quite important. The chairman was questioning you a little while ago about the potential price deltas between some of the bids. I mean, to take a ridiculous example, if the domestic equivalent was 5 times more expensive than one of the foreign bids, it's unlikely to win. But I'm sure in reality it would be a lot closer than that. Now, in the Type 26 competition, a lot of people were saying, a couple of years out before the Australians and the Canadians opted for Type 26, which is a fantastic ship, brilliant capability, world class, but she's just too expensive. And, they'll never go for it because of the price delta. And yet somehow BAE Systems, working with the unions, managed to come up with a solution that was price competitive. So while you're here, could you give us some idea of what the unions have done working with the management of some of these yards to try and keep the prices as competitive as possible? Because I understand, anecdotally, you've done quite a lot of work like that, and I think it's only fair we give you a chance to explain what you've done.
I mean, we've had regular meetings. Of course, what we don't know is the prices, what the competitors are going to come in on. So a lot of it's kind of based on what happened previously with the Mars contract, But the companies are saying that they believe that they can get a bid that is very close, so if they can get a bid that is very close, then taking in all those other factors, the return tax, national insurance, no welfare benefits if the jobs don't come, we would argue, that should be weighted in favour of UK yards. As I said earlier, we've never at any time have our members said we should get this work at all cost, at any cost. Not at all. We understand there's a need for saving taxpayers' money, But it's a false economy. It's not a level playing field. If there is no, the only return to the Treasury, if it's awarded overseas, will be to an economy in Japan, South Korea, Spain or Italy. You know, but if it comes to the UK and we can come close, then that return surely.
On this committee, we've had our own run-ins with the Treasury from time to time down the years. So we, slightly for different reasons, we could share some of your frustrations. But, Ross, I don't want to be accused of leading the witness, as they say, in legal circles, but I do understand that the unions have actually, come up with some agreements with management in some of these yards, to try and improve productivity, to keep prices as competitive as possible. So I wonder if there's anything you could say about that.
We've always been willing to engage with all of the employers in terms of whatever it takes, for the workforce to be as flexible as possible, to improve productivity. We've done that time and time again, and we'll continue to do. And if those were the reasons that were looking in some way going to be holding us back, then we would continue to do that. Absolutely, But it's this subsidised aspect makes it really difficult. You could put in all the hard work in the world and come up with something, a really good, meaningful, reasonable bid, and then for some of those reasons that we've set out, you could end up,
Are you saying that some of the competitors are offering, as it were, to profile the bid differently, so that they'll maybe subsidise some of the costs early on in order to reduce the MOD's outlay and make it easier for the MOD to afford in the first few years? And you're saying that the British consortium would have trouble doing that. Is that what you're telling us?
Well, the British consortium, it would be the companies themselves who would have to put any monies up. Whereas if the competitors are indirectly or directly state-owned, state-subsidised, then they're at an advantage because the state is looking to secure the work. Whereas the UK government is not subsidising in any way. So the onus would be on the employers to, for any monies that have to be put up front to stay in the running, shall we say, would have to be done by the companies themselves. And that's a concern for us because shareholders, would be understanding if they thought there was some long-term gain, but to put up money with no guarantees and up against competitors who are willing to basically write a blank cheque.
A tough call for the Chief Executive BAE Systems.
BAE, but yes, the team, yeah. It's a concern we've got.
Okay, I've got one more quick one, and I think Ruth wanted to come in, Jem. You mentioned, Mr Turner, the contract about the RFAs to provide support to them, and I think also it touches on some survey and hydrographical vessels as well. To what degree will that help to protect jobs and skills?
That's the one I was referring to earlier when I mentioned about Camel Laird, because there was 4 contracts and Camel Laird won the 2 biggest of the 4. And as I said earlier, 3 days after that, the government announced that contract. Camel Laird were announcing 291 redundancies. Now, Steve's right. The unions have worked hard and campaigned and worked to mitigate that. But 3 days after an announcement on a contract, and I remember some of the headline figures that came out from the government's release. It talked about 700 jobs over 10 years, covering 17 ships. But you've got Camel Laird, who's won 2 of the 4, the 2 biggest of 4 contracts, announcing 291 redundancies from at that time from a workforce of 480. So whilst we would welcome any additional work, that kind of places things in a little bit of context. If you've got the company that's won 2 of the 4, the 2 biggest, and they're prepared to, lose close to 60% of the workforce, it didn't.
Without those contracts, would Camel Laird have closed?
Without those contracts?
Without those contracts, would Camel Laird have closed?
I don't think they would have closed, but there would certainly have been a massive reduction, and it's taken some. The work that we've been doing jointly with the Mayor, under the Mayor, the task force up there, and all other stakeholders, because there's a bigger picture here. So there's been people who've been redeployed to other stakeholders, companies for short term, because they know that there'll be some work coming in. But it's, as I say, whilst we welcome any work, I think if you look at the, there's a difference between refit, maintenance work and shipbuilding, and a refit contract would not sustain shipbuilding capacity in the UK. That's a key difference. They're related trades, but very different work.
Thanks, Jim.
It was just a very little one, following on from Mark's questions to both of you. And I think Steve and Ross, with your GMB hat on, I think what Mark may have really been trying to get at is in working in partnership with the employers to actually deliver not just efficiencies, but to deliver a offering for the FSS that is actually competable. So it was how the union are actually involved in making the consortium viable. So like your day-to-day involvement in it. So not just I think it's more the details of your partnership agreement really in terms of how you're working together with the employer.
Yeah, you put that better than I did.
It's different language. I think we hear it's a different. Yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I mean, sometimes we do work in partnership, of course. We do have mutual interests, and securing the FSS contract is a huge mutual interest between ourselves and an alliance of employers, actually, across whether it comes from Harland and Wolff or what would have been down in Appledore, of course, or AMP or whatever it might be. There's huge potential for not just the retention of skilled jobs, but the promotion of apprenticeships for the next generation who want to enter into decent jobs, skilled apprenticeships. So we will do whatever, and we are doing, of course we are doing. We sit down every day of the week when we're not sitting in here talking to you lovely people. We're of course out there talking to employers about how we can improve the job security prospects of the people that we represent. And it does mean looking at how we become more productive, of course. It does look at efficiencies, it does look at shift systems, and we're doing all sorts of work with the employers group, the consortium, to make sure that we can put in the most competitive bid that we can on behalf of UK PLC. So those agreements are constantly we're at work, constantly on those. In fact, it's not me and Ross, of course, it's our conveners. It's our conveners and our shop stewards inside those yards that are sitting down day in, day out with the employers' representatives, local management teams, to make sure that that works. But you are constantly undermined if the risk is being underwritten in other yards by governments, of course. Because that's what they really do. Even if they're not state supporting or state subsidising, they're underwriting the risk associated with